There are high achievers who don't burn out. And so they say, but look at how successful I am because my self-criticism and my shame, this is the secret for my success. And what I say to them is, imagine how successful you would be if you could drop the self-criticism and the shame. Like, you wouldn't lose your drive. You wouldn't lose your intelligence. You wouldn't lose your commitment to excellence. You would just lose that fear that, honestly, like, we think that the self-criticism is driving us forward and the self-doubt is driving us forward. It's like a giant weight that we've been carrying around on our shoulders. And if we can get rid of that and embrace self-compassion, you would soar even higher. And so this is what I used to think: if it doesn't hurt, it's not working. If it's enjoyable, it's not work. It doesn't count. And like, what I realized is actually, like, when we're pushing ourselves to our breaking points, even if we're still really high functioning and producing, it doesn't even leave open the area for the highest level thinking and production and synergy and all of that amazing stuff that happens when we are fueled with positive energy and intrinsic motivation as opposed to just fear and shame.
In a world where high achievers often grapple with burnout in the relentless pursuit of success, could the answer to fulfillment be as simple as being kinder to ourselves? Hey there, Health Feast listeners, Dr. Rock here. And in today's episode, I'm super excited to welcome Jordana Confino, a certified professional coach, speaker, and advisor who's renowned for her expertise in positive psychology and well-being. A graduate of Yale Law School, Jordana was on a promising legal career path when she experienced the severe burnout that high achievers often face. Her own path to recovery ultimately led her to found JC Coaching and Consulting, where she now empowers lawyers and other professionals to transform their lives and their work for the better. Jordana has an unparalleled ability to connect with and inspire everyone she meets, which has made her a sought-after figure in the field of personal and professional development. In our conversation today, Jordana delves into the profound impact of perfectionism on our mental and physical health. Jordana shares her personal story of reaching a breaking point, realizing the toxic effects of her inner critic, and how she transformed her life by embracing self-compassion. Jordana is a professor at Fordham Law School in New York City, where she teaches law students about the power of positive psychology. Her aim is to equip students and professionals with tools and strategies to build meaningful and satisfying careers by aligning professional pursuits with personal values. In this episode, Jordana also offers practical insights into how we can all benefit from treating ourselves with the same kindness that we extend to others. She explains the science behind self-compassion, the importance of aligning our lives with our core values, and how small, actionable steps can lead to significant changes in our overall well-being. We also discuss the challenges of balancing professional and personal lives and the role of mentors and leaders in fostering positive work culture, and the transformative power of authentic human connections. Jordana also sheds light on the link between perfectionism and chronic pain, illustrating from her own example of how our mental state can manifest physically, and offering strategies to break this cycle. We delve into her experience with mind-body medicine and how positive psychology principles can be applied to address physical health issues. By the end of our conversation, it becomes clear that the path to true success is not paved with relentless self-criticism, but rather with self-acceptance and a commitment to our well-being. So, whether you're on a walk, maybe on your commute home, or winding down the day with a cup of tea, this episode is the perfect companion. Join me as I dive into this conversation with Jordana Confino and uncover powerful strategies to overcome perfectionism and embrace a more fulfilling and balanced life. So let's do the show. Well, and Jordana, I got very intrigued. I was like, oh, there's like I'm a physician, and for many years I was like on the wellness committee for our hospital, and I was working with my colleagues, other doctors and other healthcare providers who are like very burnt out, or nowadays we say moral injury, but we can talk about that. But I wonder if the same thing applies, like if there's a moral injury in law as well. Anyway.
Absolutely. I think that where you were going, you were saying you got intrigued because you were talking about this stuff with doctors.
Oh, yeah. Yes. I was talking about this stuff with doctors, and then I saw, oh, wow, like this is happening all across society in like every industry, right?
And it's interesting. So initially when I started, I was just working with lawyers. And even still, I think my website speaks directly to lawyers because lawyers will only listen to you if they think that you're only speaking to lawyers for the most part, because lawyers think they're very special. But I started talking about what I was doing with my husband works in finance, and we have friends who work in medicine. They're like, wait, we need the exact same stuff. And I'm like, yeah. So basically, I think high achieving professionals who need to get out of their own way, the niche of my focus has expanded from lawyers to that, because I think that there's so many different industries that really suffer from the same kind of high achiever mentality that doesn't foster peak health or peak happiness or peak performance, and yet they think that it does, and that's the whole issue.
Totally. I hear that. And you at one point were in school saying, I want to be an attorney. Like,
Yep.
talk to us about that. Talk to me about that. Like, where did that dream come from, and what did that dream look like?
Yeah, I don't even know if it's right to call it a dream. It wasn't my dream. It certainly wasn't my dream. And it's interesting. I've listened to enough of your podcast episodes to know that there was some family societal pressure on you to get into medicine in the first place. And I got into law for all of the wrong reasons. I was a psychology major in undergrad. I took it because I loved it. And I was also interested in teacher prep. Those were the things that actually called to me. But starting in high school, I had just become what can only be described as a raging overachiever. And I went to Yale College. And so my junior year, all of my friends were getting their finance and consulting internships, and doing psychology or teaching didn't feel shiny or prestigious enough for whatever reason to me at that time. I knew I didn't want to do finance or consulting. And so what do type A overachieving, meticulous attention to detail people do when they don't know what they want to do? A lot of them go to law school. I went basically for that reason and that reason alone. And then I had to quickly concoct a better reason than that, even a reason to tell myself, because there was some cognitive dissonance in that for me. So I basically decided that I wanted to be a federal criminal prosecutor for totally half-baked, externally driven reasons, vaguely related to some of the human rights advocacy work I had been doing earlier in life. It was also very prestigious, and I just got to law school day one. I'm like, I want to be a federal criminal prosecutor. That's really super prestigious, competitive thing. I need to clerk. I need to clerk again. I need to do big law. And that was the last time for a long time that I even contemplated, what do I want? I never contemplated why. I just had, what do I want to do? How do I do everything that I need to do it? How do I do those things to death so that I am, first in line for these things that I've told myself I want, and then set off guns blazing in that direction, and was really good at getting the things that I had told myself that I had wanted. And then once I had gotten a fair number of them, kind of hit my breaking point in multiple ways, mentally, physically, all of the things. And it was at that point where I was like, oh, maybe this wasn't the right approach.
What's fascinating to me in all of that is you said, I didn't know why I wanted this. I knew what I wanted. And the why you sort of got at was like, oh, this is societal expectation of me. But actually it was your own construct, right? It was your construct of what you thought society wants of you.
Completely.
Talk about that a little bit. Like, you're so in your head that you're not even aware of the path, because it's not an easy path. I mean,
Yeah.
you're going to like very prestigious schools. You have to work very hard academically, as you're saying. On externally, it may seem, wow, this is a very noble path she's taking.
And I mean, and that's the thing. I think there are a lot of people that want to be prosecutors for very noble reasons, and those were not my reasons. And so really, I mean, all of my work right now is focusing a lot about this, deep-seated perfectionism that drives us. And that really at its core, the underlying thing is a deep, deep sense of lack of worthiness and hustling to try to achieve those feelings of worthiness. And so for me, that's what I was getting at. And so I told you earlier that I was a raging overachiever. I can pinpoint it down to like the month, my freshman year of high school, when that flip switched on for me, or that switch flipped on. I always forget which way that is. And it was actually, so my father at the time got really, really, really sick, and it was really scary, and it was very uncontrollable. And I was the second daughter. And somehow, and this is, I figured this all out looking back with my therapist many, many years later, but the way that I could, make the family happy, the way that I could be the good girl to kind of make things better in my way was to bring home perfect grades. And so I started doing that, and I quickly realized, like, oh, my grades, that's something that the only thing that if I can just control it, if I just work hard enough, I can control it and I can make it perfect. Fast forward in life, there was also things that came up with like body and eating, and like that became another thing that, oh, I can perfect that and control that if I just work hard enough. And so that was my thing. And so I felt that if I could just, get enough accolades or get enough achievements, I would reach that point of feeling worthy enough and good enough. And then what happened was, there was one day when I just had this like crystal clear, oh my God, there's always going to be the next achievement. And the more I achieve, the more anxious and insecure I'm getting, because I'm just getting increasingly scared that I'm not going to be able to rise to that next level, and will end up disappointing everyone and just exposing that I am a total fraud. And it was actually a summer when I was working in a big law firm, and this is like right when I'm starting to get to my breaking point. So I had increasingly distracting anxiety, all of the mental health signals I was just ignoring. Then I started getting the physical health signals, so debilitating chronic pain, gut issues, all that stuff. And so I'm like getting to the end here, and I finally start working with a therapist, finally. And she had me do a very, very, very basic values exercise where it's like, let's look at this list of 100 values and identify your top 3 to 5, and then think about how what you're doing is furthering them. And this is the first time that I realized, actually just explicitly, oh, I'm spending literally all of my time and energy, like truly killing myself, blocking out every other aspect of my life in order to do this stuff that's not only not furthering my values, but actually directly contrary to them. So like my top values are love and connection. And meanwhile, I had walled off every aspect of my personal life. I was so lonely, it physically hurt. And I'm working to be a prosecutor, which is like not loving, nurturing connection, what actually fueled me. But even more alarming for me is I realized that was the first time in my entire life that I had ever stopped to ask myself, what are my values? What do I care about? Like that was never even a relevant question for me up until that point. And I don't think that I'm unique in that, in terms of high achieving profession.
No, well, okay. So many things you said. Actually, now I'm like asking myself, am I a perfectionist? And actually, I read something you wrote recently, and it resonated with me, because it was like, being a perfectionist doesn't mean that everything is perfect. It means that you want everything to be perfect.
Yeah.
And that you anguish about it when it's not. And
Yep.
I was like, and actually, like, I probably doesn't even correlate with the amount of things that are, what is perfect, right? Like there's no, right. So then it's this, talk to us about that. It's more this like internal state that you're creating, like you're almost like poisoning yourself.
Oh my gosh, absolutely. And so this is something, and I'll come back to this in a second, because I think that defining perfectionism is the key first step to de-glorifying it, because I think there's so many misconceptions out there about perfectionism that prevent people from making any effort to rein it in because either they don't think it's applicable or they don't want to. But what I was going to say about, in terms of you saying poisoning yourself, so I didn't come to this perfectionism thing until there was basically 2 pivots in my career journey. So the first one was when I discovered positive psychology. And then that inspired me to stop practicing law, start teaching well-being to lawyers and law students, and to change lots of aspects of my life. I thought that that was it. I thought that I'm like, okay, good. I figured it out, right? Fast forward, I'm working in legal education, teaching well-being, aligning with my values, had taken more time for personal relationships, all these things that the Positive Psych 101 should tell me that I'm living my best life, and I burned myself out. And I realized that it was because I hadn't done anything I changed all these external things, but I hadn't done anything to change the way that I was speaking to myself in my head and my relationship with myself. And so I was still fueling myself with this harsh fear and shame-based messaging and relating to myself in this ruthlessly critical perfectionist manner. And I realized, I'm like, oh, you can take the girl out of the toxic work environment, but if you don't take the toxic boss out of her brain, she's going to drive herself into the ground. And so really this perfectionism, which is this way of relating to ourselves in our work, I think is actually like the most pernicious thing for so many people working in an industry. And so many people think like, oh, I need to leave the toxic environment and then it'll get better. And oh, there are so many toxic aspects of these professional environments we're working in. Those need to get addressed. But just like how the individual work can't solve the systemic issues can't change if the individuals aren't willing to change their mindset too. And so the perfectionism, starting with what it's not. So perfectionism is not, like you said, doing everything perfectly. And perfectionism is also not synonymous with high standards, drive for excellence, commitment to detail, all of these positive things. But perfectionism is thinking we should be able to do everything perfectly on our first try with zero pain, effort, detours, obstacles, anything getting in the way. And then if we're unable to live up to that unrealistic standard, impossible standard, there's something wrong with us. And the way to motivate ourselves to move towards that standards is to criticize ourselves and to shame ourselves and to pressure ourselves in that way. So it's a very fixed mindset approach towards performance that leaves no space for growth or inevitable trade-offs or sacrifices that you might need to make. And so what happens is that people try to there's kind of 2 ways that people can react to this. One is just like the overwork and burnout because you're just running yourself into the ground trying to do this. Another one, and this is something that surprises people a lot, is that procrastination is actually really linked with perfectionism because we'll waste all of this time because we're so scared to start because we feel like we need to get it perfect on the first try. And so for a lot of people, that's how it can show up. And so no procrastinators think that they're a perfectionist because they think, oh, perfectionist means that you're perfect. So you've gotten all the work done in advance perfectly. And so it can show up in all of these different ways that people don't necessarily see, which prevents them from getting to the root of it.
So you highlight, wow, that really resonates so much with what you're saying. You highlight the importance of self-talk and beliefs and how that, I'm curious how that you came to those epiphanies of like the self-talk I'm having is not working. And how did you come to positive psychology?
Yeah, well, so 2 different things. So there's the positive psychology and then there's the self-talk. So positive psychology, I came to, it's funny, literally Googling how to be happy. When I had just reached my breaking point as a lawyer, I was so miserable, I was broken down, and I truly turned to Google thinking there has to be something that I haven't learned and no one around me has learned because everyone around me seems to be miserable. And that was the thing. I remember when I was at the big law firm, looking around, I was miserable. Everyone around me was miserable, but no one cared. That was the most alarming part. It was like everyone just thinks that this is as good as it should be. Like this is like some contract we've signed. Like you make this money and you're miserable. And for me, I was like, there has to be something. Googled how to be happy, stumbled on positive psychology, was fascinated. I ended up pursuing my certification in positive psychology just purely for my own edification at that point, because I really, really wanted to know how to be happy. And when I did it, I was the only lawyer in the program, and my mind just exploded. I realized like my entire experience would have been infinitely better in every sense of that word if I had known this. And everyone that I had come across in the legal profession was just as clueless as I was in that regard. So I was like, okay, this is what I need to do. I need to share this information with people in the legal profession. So that was when I initially pivoted towards working in legal education and student services, doing personal counseling for students. I developed a positive lawyering course, so positive psychology for lawyers. But it wasn't until later on that I discovered really the mindset work. And this I credit entirely to my excellent therapist, because again, I was working, teaching positive psychology to students, and I just burned out so hard again. And at this point, it was a point of physical burnout. It was mental burnout. And she had been trying to get me to listen to her about self-compassion for years at this point. And I had been like, no. I am just fine. Self-compassion will turn me into a weak, lazy marshmallow. Like, my drive is my edge. That is the secret for my success. Even if I was pointing it in the wrong direction, like, this is, I don't need that. And then it got to this point where things were just, I was in a low point. And what she said to me, she was like, Jordana, if you had a racehorse that had literally broken down from pain and exhaustion, would you just keep whipping it to try to get it up to run faster? And I was like, no. And she's like, then why are you doing that to yourself? And I was like, fair point. And so that was when I first opened my mind to self-compassion and started reading and about Kristin Neff's work. And really, at that point, I was like, I've got nothing to lose. I don't think this is going to work. I think this is nonsense. One part of me thought that it was nonsense. And then the second part of me thought, even if this isn't nonsense, even if self-compassion won't make me weak, lazy, and complacent, because I saw the great thing about Kristin Neff is that she's got all of this research showing that that is not the case. Actually, it'll turbocharge your performance and your motivation, not the opposite. So I'm like, okay, even if I buy in on a rational level, I do not believe that I can change the way that I think, because my brain is so ruthlessly self-critical and it's so instinctive and it's so entrenched that I was like, I'm just spoiled goods. Like, this is, given my probably part nature, part nurture, this is where I am. And yet I think I was just in a point of desperation. And also I'd seen the science about neuroplasticity. And I'm like, okay, you know what? I'll try. I've got nothing to lose at this point, because what I'm doing clearly isn't working anymore. Like, pushing through was no longer an option. And it was amazing. I started doing it. And even within a couple of weeks of practicing self-compassion, and we can talk more about what that looks like, but basically it's speaking to yourself in this different way, even when you don't believe those thoughts. And then suddenly those thoughts are becoming slightly more plausible and slightly more plausible. And then they're popping up on their own. And as that voice starts growing stronger, the critic's voice starts growing weaker. And it was just this insane thing. And the reason that I love it so much, and the reason I love teaching this so much, well, I mean, first of all, I just think that it's the most important, powerful thing that I can share with anyone. But I also feel like I'm uniquely well situated to teach it, because I don't think there was anyone who could have been more skeptical about it, or like so far in the other direction, that I feel like if I can learn how to do this, literally anyone, there's no one whose inner critic can be so harsh that they can't cultivate self-compassion.
So yeah, talk us through like how we can harness self-compassion. Like, what are the steps you kind of go through?
Absolutely. So the first, step 0 is understanding why you would even want to in the first place. And this is where, thank goodness, there's so much both research in like terms of behavioral science showing the impact on people, but also brain science and like brain imaging studies showing why self-criticism and shame and fear are actually not effective motivators, and why self-compassion fuels motivation and learning and development. So I think the problem is that so many high-achieving people have been basically culturized to believe that self-criticism is the best way to motivate ourselves, or fear is the best way to motivate ourselves. And it turns out that's actually not the case, because when we berate ourselves every time we make a mistake or we fail or anything like that, we're implicitly teaching ourselves that it's not safe to try again. So we'll try to avoid challenges and things that would actually enable us to learn and grow. It fosters that performance-based goal. So I'll want to do things that I know that I'm good at in order to look smart or look good, to try to avoid that shame on the other side of making a mistake, as opposed to realizing that mistakes are like how we learn and grow.
Those negative, no, it's just interesting. Those negative emotions are holding us in this fixed mindset.
Yes,
is what I'm hearing.
Absolutely. And so, because the thing is that why is failure so painful? There's the disappointment of not getting what we want, but then the thing that's really painful is what happens. So I'm trying to think of an example. So let's go into an illegal environment, right? And I'm taking on a new assignment of something that I haven't done before. It's just stretch assignment. And it comes back looking like it's bleeding in red line from the supervising partner. That can be, there's the pain of like, oh, that's disappointing, or whatever happens with that. Or if you're applying for something, you don't get it. There's the pain of, oh, I'm disappointed I didn't get it. But if you then are, what's wrong with you? You're clearly not good enough to do this. Why are you so stupid? You should have done this. You're beating into yourself. That compounds the pain like 1,000-fold, right? And so we're teaching ourselves that it is so painful to not do something perfectly. And so then what do we want to do next? We want to avoid those situations. So we don't want to even put ourselves in a situation where we could be caused to feel not good enough. And so that means that we constrain ourselves by only doing things that we know are good. We stop putting ourselves out there. So that's one thing. But another thing is that people think that the self-criticism will motivate them to make sure that they don't make those mistakes again, or they do better next time. Rather than they think, oh, well, if I respond to myself with self-compassion when I don't do something the way that I want, I'll just be like self-indulgent. It's making excuses, and I'll grow complacent. I won't keep trying to get better. And all of the research shows it's actually the opposite of that. So they have studies on students who get a disappointing grade, and if they treat themselves with self-criticism versus self-compassion, with the self-compassion, they're much more likely to study harder and do better the next time than if they treat themselves with self-criticism, because we're basically deflating ourselves and stripping away our energy. And in brain scan studies, what they show is that when we are under a fight or flight response, so when there's extreme stress, which if you're if you're dousing yourself in self-criticism, that it provokes your stress response. What it does is it causes the amygdala to flare up, so the part of our brain that governs emotional reactivity. And what that does is it shuts off, it causes the prefrontal cortex, so the part of our brain that governs rational thinking, to temporarily go offline. And so they call this amygdala hijacking mode, because basically we send ourselves into this intense emotional reactivity and we lose capacity for rational thought. And so basically, we're just shutting down and we're just consumed with feelings of shame and how bad we are. Whereas if you treat yourself with self-compassion, and we could talk about what that entails, what you're not saying is like, oh, I'm perfect, I don't need to improve. What you're saying is like, oh yeah, this is really disappointing because I didn't do as well as I wanted. Let's take a step back and strategically examine, what could I do better next time? Like, what went wrong here? And so it settles our nervous system enough for us to stay online and actually take constructive steps forward. So it's the opposite of being complacent.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. It's like what went wrong, but also you can think like what went right. I'm thinking like, I hear this a lot, but you can't oftentimes control for the outcome.
Yep.
Like athletes say this all the time. Like if you're going for a race or something, anything you have control over is your preparation and your personal performance. But if something happens that day, if it's raining, if, don't have control over that. Yeah, I'm thinking of that because of what you're saying. You're saying like, The other thing that really stuck out to me is how these negative emotions, they really narrow your focus.
Yep.
Right? Like you become so focused on these negative feelings and then the negative storyline that you're telling yourself. And by sort of, I want to hear from you now, like how does one recognize that? And you said step 0 is like sort of knowing why yeah.
And then step 1 is recognizing the self-criticism first. And you're absolutely right with the narrow thinking. And this is just a side thing in positive psychology. Barbara Fredrickson, broaden and build theory of positive emotions shows the enormous cognitive benefits of positive emotions in terms of it broadens our creativity, it enhances our problem-solving skills. And so again, like this is how this negative thinking and the self-critical thinking actually shuts us down and prevents us from performing. But the first step is to notice your critical self-talk. And so I guess step 0.5 is cultivating some sort of mindfulness so you can actually notice thoughts in general, because I know that for a lot of people, they have no conception of their thoughts. They just are their thoughts. They don't see their thoughts. And so a basic cultivation of mindfulness so that you notice your self-critic, because for so many people, it's so ingrained that they don't even notice when their inner critic voice is present and piping up. And so even just asking yourself, like, what thoughts go through your head when you're feeling anxious or insecure or disappointed when something goes wrong? What voice is chiming up? What phrases come up again and again? Like, does it remind you of anyone in your past who was critical of you, like a parent or a coach? And really just familiarizing yourself with your inner critic. And then when you see that thought coming up, like you're stupid, you're worthless, or what's wrong with you, trying to imagine that. So actually, it's really it sounds floofy at first, but actually the studies show that if you can psychologically distance yourself from that voice, it makes it much easier to intercept it and interrupt it. And so I actually have all of my clients and students imagine their critics as this separate being and actually draw them. And then they can imagine that voice is coming from this little like critter. So mine's like a little, you can imagine it like a little devil on your shoulder, right? And then practice even just noticing and familiarizing yourself with it is the first step. And that takes some work. And then once you notice it, the next step is to soften its approach. And so what we can't do is, what doesn't help is just saying, all right, I'm just going to abolish you, or I'm going to shout you down, because we can't just make it go away. We also can't stop it from coming up. And so I think a big challenge for a lot of people is that they're like, I can't succeed in this because it keeps popping up. And it's kind of like in mindfulness when you say the thought isn't, the point isn't to clear your mind, it's to notice when your mind has wandered and to bring it back. And so the point in self-compassion isn't to extinguish your critic immediately, it's to notice when your critic pops up and to respond to it with self-compassion. And so when you notice the critic has popped up, first acknowledging too that it's coming from a caring place. And so it's coming from a place of anxiety and wanting to help, because it wants us to succeed. That's where the self-criticism is coming from, this deep-rooted fear of not being good enough and desperate desire to feel good enough. And so the critic thinks it's helping us, but it's not. So even just acknowledging that and being like, hey, critic, I see you. I know that you really care about this and you want me to do well, but I also know that you're just kind of amping up my anxiety and distracting me. And so we're going to take another approach. And then the last step here is to respond to yourself as you would a dear friend in your situation. And so what would you say if someone similarly situated who you really support that person unconditionally came to you and was saying, I messed up at work, so I'm worthless? What would you say to them? Would you say, yeah, you messed up at work, so you're worthless, you're perfect or you're nothing? All those things you're saying to yourself? Probably not. You would say something of like, oh, that's really painful. Like, I totally understand why you're so disappointed, but like everyone makes mistakes and this has no bearing on your ability to do this next time, or your boss isn't going to hate you because you had one flip up. Like, this happens to everyone. Like, you can do this. So whatever you would say to someone else in that situation, and practice saying those thoughts to yourself. And for most people, it's really hard to conjure those thoughts. You can't even like come up with it. So one thing that can be helpful is like imagine either a dear friend or imagine yourself as like a little kid before, so young that it was before all of your deep-rooted criticism came in. And imagine if they were coming to you being like, I'm worthless, I'm terrible. Like, what would you say to them? And then even once you can come up with the thoughts, you almost certainly won't believe them at first, especially when you're start practicing this. And that doesn't, so expect that and still keep practicing, because of the way that neuroplasticity works. Every time that we think a thought, even if we're thinking it on purpose, the connection between the neurons that fire to facilitate that thought, they actually grow stronger. And so every time you push yourself to think a thought, it will become a little bit easier. That's why our self-critical thoughts are so freaking sticky and powerful, because we've been thinking them on replay. And so it's this kind of just literally practicing speaking to yourself in this way. And over time, and I promise you, it won't take nearly as much time as you might think, those thoughts will become easier and you'll believe them more. And as those thoughts grow stronger, your inner critic starts to lose some of its power.
And how does one, if let's say, someone's listening and they're like, yeah, I have this huge inner critic and I'm not aware of it. Like it's going off. Like what does one do? What do you do to cultivate that awareness?
Yeah, absolutely. And so it's so interesting, and it's such a wonderful question, because there are people who are like, oh, well, I don't have critical thoughts. And I'm like, okay, so tell me the feelings. Tell me the situation and tell me the feelings. And so they'll say, okay, I mess up at work. And then I'm going to say, okay, how do you feel? And they're like, well, I feel nauseous and I feel ashamed. And then I say, if that feeling was saying something to you, what is it saying? And kind of asking yourself, like, for some people, that's such a foreign concept because people have different levels of self-awareness. But even just saying, like, so this feeling was saying something, what is it saying? And then even just a basic mindfulness practice. And you can do this through meditation. But if you don't like meditation, which a lot of people don't, especially, high achieving people who don't want to slow down for a minute, even stealth mindfulness. So paying attention to the sensation as you brush your teeth and just focusing on that awareness rather than just letting your brain go on autopilot. Even if you train yourself with little mindful practices like that, it will start to create this deeper sense of awareness where then if you start asking yourself, if this physical feeling or this emotional feeling was saying something, what would it be saying? And start examining that a little bit more. I should also say, just going back to the why for 1 minute, just thinking about the nature of your podcast, the science on behavioral health change and self-compassion. So people want to stick to healthy eating, healthy exercise, smoking cessation, alcohol cessation. People who treat themselves with self-compassion, way more likely to succeed, way more motivated. And if they have a setback and they treat themselves with self-compassion rather than self-criticism, way more likely to get on the bandwagon and carry forward. And so again, it's the opposite of what we think. We think that if we're really mean to ourselves, then we'll like drill sergeant scare ourselves into submission. And the opposite is true. And it feels so counterintuitive because it's like, oh, like this is just so self-indulgent. If I, go off my diet, if I have a cookie and I say, that's really human and it's really hard to stick to a diet and you're not a worthless person because you had this cookie, you can do it. You will be so much more likely to get back on the wagon and get back on track than if you say, what's wrong with you? See, you're worthless. I told you couldn't do this. And then, all bets are off.
Well, then you feel, then it's a cycle. Like you feel shameful. And then why were you eating that cookie in the first place?
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly.
A lot of times that's how people are using food. I love that you're bringing it to behavior change and health behavior change. And we are, look at the fitness industry. Like there is a lot of that, like no pain, no gain, like, push yourself and David Goggins, be as hard as you can on yourself. And I'm with you. I think at least I think there are some people who that resonates with. I think that works for for a small number of people. Have you ever met, I've met people who say they don't like exercising and they still do it every day.
So here's one thing that is really interesting. And so there are high achievers who don't burn out. And so they say, but look at how successful I am because my self-criticism and my shame, this is the secret for my success. And what I say to them is, imagine how successful you would be if you could drop the self-criticism and the shame. Like, you wouldn't lose your drive. You wouldn't lose your intelligence. You wouldn't lose your commitment to excellence. You would just lose that fear that, honestly, like, we think that the self-criticism is driving us forward and the self-doubt is driving us forward. It's like a giant weight that we've been carrying around on our shoulders. And if we can get rid of that and embrace self-compassion, you would soar even higher. So what I say to those people who have excellent self-discipline, impulse control, determination, if they could find a form of exercise that didn't make them miserable, I bet they would be even more fit than they are right now. And so this is what I used to think: if it doesn't hurt, it's not working. If it's enjoyable, it's not work. It doesn't count. And like, what I realized is actually, like, when we're pushing ourselves to our breaking points, even if we're still really high functioning and producing, it doesn't even leave open the area for the highest level thinking and production and synergy and all of that amazing stuff that happens when we are fueled with positive energy and intrinsic motivation, as opposed to just fear and shame.
Ooh, that's so wonderful to think. Like, I might be high achieving, but how am I holding myself back from becoming and being who I really am meant to be because of that inner critic and that voice?
Absolutely. Yeah. And this came up in one of the recent conversations you had on the podcast with Michelle about joy. And she talked about Bob Valler's dualistic model of passion. So there's the harmonious passion and the obsessive passion. And I remember when I was first learning positive psychology, I was like, this dualistic model of passion, this is what I'm going to lead with, because when I needed this stuff the most, I didn't care about being happy or healthy. I just wanted to be successful. And the dualistic model of passion can appeal to even the workaholic who only wants to succeed or the athlete or whoever who just wants to be, the best performer. And what it shows is, like, when we try to drive ourselves in this obsessive manner, it's the object of our passion is the only thing that we care about, whether it's our fitness, whether it's our work, whether it's our craft, whatever it is. And we're fueling ourselves from this place of fear because it is our identity, and our identity rides and falls on our ability to do this thing perfectly. If you compare them to people who are harmoniously passionate, so they care, they devote substantial energy, but they're coming at it from a place of intrinsic motivation, and also they're able to keep it in harmony with other aspects of their lives. Harmoniously passionate people perform just as well over the short term as obsessively passionate people. But over the long term, they actually perform better because they're far less susceptible to burnout and breaking. And I think that people just don't see. They think, oh, well, this is getting me this far. I can't succeed without it. And it's like, you don't even know, because you've been doing it your whole life, or for your whole career, or for your whole adult life. And they just don't even understand, what could be if they could pull back a teeny bit and to say, do a baby toe step of faith. Because if you ask any lawyer to take a leap of faith, they'll look at you like you're insane, and explore a different way.
Going back to you, it's so interesting also that you had found seemingly your dream job. You're teaching well-being. You're super passionate. Obviously, like, I can tell so much energy and passion around this. And there's an irony there too, because you were teaching all this curriculum about positive psychology and well-being, and then at some point you burnt out. And what did that look like? And does everyone need to reach a breaking point before they make these changes, or how do you reach someone, like, before they get there?
Yeah, it's a wonderful question, and I don't think everyone has to reach a breaking point. Absolutely not. And the work that I'm doing now is, I work with people on both sides. I work with people who have reach their breaking points and, helping them put themselves back together, which fortunately, is very possible. But also in so much of the work I do, it's trying to get to people before they reach their breaking point, especially the work that I do with students, but even out there with professionals too, and helping them understand the why first, like why their current path is not necessary and is not sustainable and is not optimal, and showing them. So the beauty of positive psychology is all this science that shows us how cultivating our well-being will actually fuel our performance. And so whenever I'm teaching this stuff, I never am teaching for the people who want to be, especially if I go into an organization and I'm doing like a presentation. When I work with people individually, if they come to me saying, I want to be happier, I'm like, excellent. But if I'm going to an organization, I'll never tell you, do this if you want to be happier, because the people that want to be happier, they'll listen anyways. I say, even if you don't care about being happier or healthier, here's why cultivating your well-being in these ways will make you more effective. Because I'm like, I say, I don't say this to their faces, but it's like I'm speaking to the lowest common denominator, because I'm thinking, what might I have listened to back then when I needed it the most?
But you're speaking to high achievers who care about their performance, and you're like, I'm gonna help you level up your performance. It's like
Exactly.
this is a stealth positive psychology that you're doing.
100%. And it's the same thing, by the way. It's how do I get into those organizations in the first place? I say to the leaders of those organizations, even if you don't care about your people being happy or healthy, which there are some organizations that do, there are many that don't. Here's why this is a good return on investment. Here's why you'll keep your people longer. Here's why they'll be way more effective and engaged if you can give them a sense of meaning and connection and joy in their work. Here's why that'll be really good for business, in addition to just like being the right thing to do.
I wonder though, like, and I know I hear like young attorneys right out of school, like their job is, I mean, the demands put on them are external. And when you're talking to students, like what advice do you give them to prepare for that? Or how can they protect themselves, the right way to say it?
Absolutely. So there's a couple of different strategies. So first of all, there's a lot of different jobs in law. And so there are certain jobs that maybe are not as capital P prestigious or as high paying that might actually be much more rewarding for them. I think that what do you want to do with your law degree and why is the first question. But let's say we're assuming the ones that are going to the big law firm with the most grueling hours. There's people that want to do that because they really like that work. There's people that want to do that because they have immense loans to pay off and families to provide for. And so all of that is well and great, but I think understanding your why and having an intrinsic, again, going back to my story, a value-based why. So even if you're going to the big corporate law firm, what's the reason that you're there? And let's find something that's better than just the pay. So even if it's, I have a deep value of love or stability, and going to this place is going to enable me to provide for my family, or like whatever the value is that you can connect this to, that itself will help stave off burnout by just having an intrinsic value, as opposed to like, oh, I'm just pushing paper around for a living because it's prestigious. Like that is a very low form of motivation. Then nailing in your non-negotiables. So what amount of sleep, what amount of movement, what amount of social connection do you need in order to like function optimally? Because a lot of them will be like, oh, I'm going underground, gotta just throw all of my healthy behavior habits out. And that is the quickest way to burn out. And so finding ways, even if you can't go to the gym in the same way, or you can't hang out with your friends in the same way, finding even like micro moments of connection, finding even exercise snacks throughout the day, right, to keep yourself moving, recognizing the importance of sleep, again, for your functioning, rather than being like a luxury that you don't need. So helping them see those things. And then another one is boundaries. So you'll go into a high pressure environment. Also, these environments are ones that they'll take and they'll take and they'll take and they'll take and they'll take until you break. And then they'll replace you if they need to. And so how can you draw some boundaries that no one's going to tell you to draw boundaries, but there are certain boundaries that you will not get penalized for drawing and will actually end up serving you better? Because this is what I always talk about. I say, don't strive for perfectionism, strive for big picture perfection. So Perfectionism is like, oh, well, I need to say yes to every single thing that comes in the door so I don't disappoint anyone. Big picture perfection is realizing, well, not only do they care if you say yes, they also care if the work is done well. And so if you are just vastly overcommitting yourself and doing shoddy work product because you just don't have the time or the bandwidth to do it, they're not going to be happy. So how do you draw those boundaries? And then also, again, going back to the self-compassion, what are you saying to yourself in your head? Because if you have, let's say you're working really hard hours, you've got really challenging work, there's demands being put on you. Let's say that brings you to an 8 on the stress scale or a 9. Now let's add to that, you're terrible. Why aren't you working hard enough? What's wrong with you? You're so stupid. You don't really deserve to be here. Why did you mess that up? Did you really say the right thing in that email? You add that constant stream of doubt and criticism on top. That is what's going to spill you over. Whereas if you're saying like, this is tough, but like, you're doing a good job. I'm proud of you. Like, you've got this. You can do this. Or even if it's just neutral, let's not even say that you're like pumping yourself up. You're just not pouring fuel on the fire. That makes such a huge difference in terms of your mental health, your energy. Also, all that self-criticism in your head, that takes time. And so if like when you are thinking about how bad you are, what you're not thinking about is what do you do next to get this work done? And so that's why I feel like, even though going back to what you said, like those systemic issues, all the things we can't control, something that we can always control is how we're talking to ourselves in our own heads. And that, again, it's not going to solve the problem, but it will take you from an 8 to a 12 or an 8 to a 5 in terms of where is your stress, where is your well-being.
Yeah. Well, it's calling to mind, well, it's like I said, I did a lot of work with wellness in the hospital I used to work at. And it was almost like I remember hearing one of the wellness leaders say like, you know, what we don't want is everyone like realizing that they have like a terrible environment and that's not their value, and then they decide to leave. And I don't know. I mean, do you think when you're I mean, you mentioned maybe they need to think about alternative options for how they might practice law, and maybe that there is this sort of like path probably that young law students have in their head, like this is just like you did, and so, you know, helping them see beyond that and maybe see the bigger picture. Yeah, that's really cool.
But that's the stuff with students too. And so I have different hats. So I have my law professor hat where these students, they haven't yet decided what path they want. And the truth is that it's not good for the firms. It's not good for the organization to have people that are there for the wrong reasons, because they're not going to last. And they're not going to be peak motivated when they're there. So all of the studies on motivation and behavioral science show that economic incentives and fear and pressure-based incentives, they can motivate people to a certain extent, but not optimally and not over the long term. But if we can help people be there for the right reasons and tap into these intrinsic form of motivations, they'll be so much better. And so for the law students, there are ones that want to go into these jobs for the right reason, and then they need to learn how to balance the pressures and the challenges. And then there's the ones that are going for all the wrong reasons. The ones that are going for all the wrong reasons, they shouldn't go because it's not going to be good for anyone. But for the ones that are there, and so this is, it's funny, like law firms will often ask me, like, you're not going to tell everyone they should leave, right? No, absolutely not. What I'm going to tell them is, what do they need to start thinking about and doing if they want to be able to stay? And if they want to be able to stay over the long term, because the thing is, it's no secret that there's a well-being issue in the legal profession. Just as I'm sure the hospitals you were at, like the cat was out of the bag, people were struggling. And so we can ignore that fact, or we can help them, which will help them stay as well. And I think especially if you can, what I really like doing is working with both the junior people and then working with people that are more senior within the organizations, because there are systemic structural things that are really hard to change. So for instance, in law, the billable hour, that is, you know, something that is not going anywhere anytime soon. But if you can teach supervisors, the how and why even cultivating little moments of connection will fuel their people with such a deeper sense of motivation in their work, or if helping them understand the purpose of, even if they're just doing a small corner of working on a small corner of the case, if you help them understand how that is supporting the bigger picture, why, if you make them feel like they matter and their work matters, which, by the way, you can do that in a really small amount of time, they will be, if you create psychological safety, they will be so much more motivated and dedicated, and the work will be better. And so helping, like, how can we create more positive cultures that are better for the people and also good for the bottom line?
Yeah. And it requires maybe I'll say it, a leap of faith from the firms and the employers too, because there's a feeling like, oh, there's tension. Like, if my employees are going to take more time for these things and to take care of themselves, then they're not doing work. But what
Yeah, but I think on the other hand, it's like, how good
they're
is the work when
doing,
they're not
right?
taking any time for themselves? And one example that comes from medicine that I love sharing with people in law. So one of the biggest things is like, well, we need to have a culture of perfectionism, because we want everything to be perfect, and we need to avoid mistakes. And it's like, do you really think that telling everyone that everything needs to be perfect and there can't be mistakes is going to prevent there from being any mistakes? No, it's just going to make sure that no one admits their mistakes, no one learns from the mistakes, and they don't get corrected early. And so the research in healthcare with psychological safety, and so it was the nurses, right? And so at first they measured, how are the team dynamic? If there's psychological safety, how does that compare to the number of mistakes made versus an environment where people are, punished for making mistakes? And what they initially found was, teams with greater psychological safety, there's more mistakes. And they're like, well, that's curious. But then they looked into it and they said, no, there's more mistakes reported, but there's actually fewer mistakes. And on the teams where people are penalized, they're just covering up their mistakes as opposed to bringing them forward. And so, like, that's how you get to malpractice suits, not people being like, oh, I made this mistake internally. Let me learn how to fix it and avoid it going forward.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a lot. Oh my God, there's a lot there in healthcare. I'm sure we could talk about. I want to actually pivot to your blog, Chronicles of a Recovering Type A Perfectionist.
Yeah, type A plus.
Type A plus perfectionist. Yeah, and I've just started reading it after we connected. First of all, you bring so much of your, just like in this conversation, you bring so much of yourself into it and your own challenges and difficulties and how much you struggle. And so I think that's just like emblematic of who you are and what you're trying to do. You said it multiple times. Like, if I can embrace self-compassion, like anyone can, and that really comes through. I haven't read it in detail enough, but now I'm starting to get like some of the pieces connected. Like, I remember reading about your wedding, you had a photo and you mentioned how you weren't able to like really walk for more than 30 minutes prior to that. And now that I'm hearing you like, these are some of the physical manifestations, I'm guessing, that you developed from all of this internal anguish and everything.
Yeah. No, that's something that I learned that blew my mind, is that perfectionism is actually so highly correlated with chronic pain, as well as all sorts of chronic autoimmune type issues that don't respond to traditional medicine. And there was multiple years in my life where I could not stand for more than 20 minutes. Right now, I don't run anymore, but I elliptical, I walk, I'm totally mobile. And it was, for me, I was all over the country, every medical expert. And it wasn't until I started doing mind-body medicine for chronic pain that I actually got the chronic pain in check. And that was just such a wild thing for me, because I feel like there's so many people, high achievers, that just struggle with pain, unexplainable pain, or unexplainable migraines, and have no idea that this could be linked to, the way that they're talking to themselves inside their heads.
Thank you for drawing attention to that. I think so many, and you mentioned IBS, irritable bowel, so many bowel symptoms that people have. Yeah, absolutely. What mind-body medicine program did you do? Or
so I discovered the Curable app.
Yeah, sure.
which is incredible. Right. And then I started working with, so I did the app on my own. And then I was like, I need more support. So this stuff makes so much sense. But again, my tendencies are so strong and so hardwired. I need support. So I started working with a fabulous coach/therapist from the Pain Psychology Center in California. And it was life-changing for me. It really, on both, is interesting. That work that I did, this was a number of years ago now, in terms of both reining in my perfectionism and my anxiety and also the pain stuff simultaneously. And I now see that they're so linked. And even now, all of flare-ups of the pain, and often it's because I'm pushing myself too hard psychologically. And so the pain, it's a danger signal to like, why do I feel like I'm in danger? And often it's because I'm slipping into those patterns. But on the blog front, I think the name is really important, not the A+ part, but the recovering part. And so if anyone reads my blog, they'll know that this is not lessons from a fully recovered perfectionist who now, has abolished these impulses and these fears and these urges. It's very much, at least for me, I haven't found a magic bullet. It is managing these things and recognizing that it's an ongoing process, and it's an ongoing process that is so worth it because every year I'm growing stronger in it. And of course, there's setbacks all the time, and then you can work through them. And every inch of progress and freedom that you get from your inner critic and your inner fear, like, it's invaluable in terms of the positive impact it has on every aspect of your life. And so I think that a lot of people, when they attempt self-help, whether it's for health, whether it's for happiness, whether it's for anything, they're like, oh, well, I should be able to, be perfectly accomplish whatever I set out for. And then they get really dejected if they notice it's hard, or if they notice they make great progress, but then they have a little bit of a setback. And I try to say, no, like, expect that, and know that that does not mean that this is not, that you're not making progress and then it's not worth it because, like, people can't see me, or maybe they can see me right now, but like, if let's say I started at negative 100 and I want to be at positive 100 and now I'm at 70, I can't tell you how much better 70 is than negative 100. I can't tell you how much better 70 is than 68. And on the days when I find myself at 60, even if I'm disappointed that I've gone from 70 or to 60, just like, how do I get to 60.2 today? And every little step that you take is just a reminder that, like, oh, you can. Like, it can be hard, and you can have an anxious urge saying, no, you must do the other thing. And if you take even that baby toe step away from it, that's reminding you that you can, and that you're not just like a slave to these anxious or perfectionist impulses.
The baby toe step. Yeah. That's the small change, the small step. We talk about small changes all the time for health behaviors, but what you're saying is that it can be even very, very small in how you talk to yourself. It can be very, very small in just acknowledging how you might be talking to yourself and acknowledging that maybe things could be different.
Absolutely. Or even like any other change. So when I'm talking to someone who's a practicing lawyer, let's say we're talking about values alignment, they're like, oh, I'm completely mismatched from my values. So my value of connection and curiosity, I'm not honoring those at all. And I have them assess themselves on a scale of 1 to 10. They're like, I'm a 3. And whatever I say is like, don't ask yourself, what would I need to do to get to a 10? Ask yourself, if you're at a 3, what would it look like to be at a 4? And how can you do that thing tomorrow? So like micro changes. So for instance, when I first did that values exercise, I was still working in law. And while I ultimately ended up leaving, pivoting, starting working in student counseling, that's directly aligned with connection. But what could I do immediately? And what did I do immediately? So I started creating even a little bit of space for personal connection. I sought out opportunities to mentor people within my workplace at the time. So like baby steps, baby changes, and they make such a difference. And so like, if you want to start doing physical activity, this, like, commit to, I always say, do the smallest thing, make it so small that your brain is like, why bother? That doesn't even count. but it does count because it's more than you're doing now. Do that for at least a week and then only let yourself do a little bit more once you were able to do that so small it doesn't count. That's how I trained my husband to practice mindfulness. I'm like, a minute every day, because a minute every day you can notice the second you're going to get into bed and be like, okay, I'm going to do it for a minute today. And he's like, this doesn't even count, Jordana. And I'm like, it is more than you've ever been able to do for more than 2 days straight. So let's start there. And that builds on that, because it's all just establishing I think that there's a lot of people who assume the identity of like hopeless perfectionist, hopeless workaholic, hopeless this, hopeless that, like whatever it is, we've embraced these identities. We don't like them, but we've embraced them of, I can't do this thing because, and that subconsciously is telling our brain, we're not going to do the thing. So for the longest time, I can't even tell you for how many years it was like my homework with my therapist was turn off your computer at 8 p.m. And every night at 8 p.m., I was like, oh, yeah, of course I'm not going to do it because like I said I was going to, but I've got this thing I need to do and I never actually do it. And then like, how do we change that identity and like give that up and be like, actually, no, I have an identity of someone who can get off even a minute earlier than my anxious brain wants me to, because I'm committed to doing one step in the direction of myself. And even once we do that and it's so amazing how easy it is to think that, oh, because this is uncomfortable or because a surge of anxiety is coming up when I say that I'm going to or not going to do this thing, that means that I can't tolerate that anxiety and do or not do the thing anyway. And I think a lot of the work involves people recognizing that we give into those urges to press the easy button on the pain. But what we don't see is that pain in the moment is so much smaller than the slow burn of the pain that's resulting from constantly giving into that urge to do or not do whatever it is. And so like helping people realize like, okay, yeah, so it makes me a little less anxious in the moment to just keep working rather than shutting the computer and having dinner with my husband. But let's look at that mounting feeling of anxiety and overwhelm and loneliness and disconnection overall. That's a lot more painful than that little surge of anxiety in the moment. And it just doesn't feel that way in the moment.
Yeah, certainly. It's like there's a disconnect there. You share a lot of, you certainly share like the stuff we've been talking about, but you share a lot of like science-backed tips and kind of ideas in the wellness space. It seems like it's a very, beneficial for you and your clients, but I love that you're bringing this to more people. What are some like learnings that you'd love to impart for people listening?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll stop proselytizing about self-compassion because I feel like I've imparted that already. I mean, I think that one thing that I focus on a lot, and I think it's just so important for especially like high achieving professionals in particular, but so many people in our current state, is like the power of connection and meaningful connection. Because this is one of those things where like, do it for the return on investment, if nothing else, because loneliness is so rampant in our current society, which is so ironic because people are so connected, but not necessarily meaningfully so. And I think there's a lot of superficial connection. And I think a lot of people are walking around with their masks of armor and confidence and perfection on and not actually getting to know anyone on a slightly deeper level. And there's so much science-backed evidence on the power of deep connection, which, by the way, doesn't have to take a lot of time. Like even micro moments of positive connections, so like a shared smile, like a 1-minute conversation where you're really present and focused on someone and your positive emotions come into sync, what that does in terms of opening up your cognitive awareness, but also literally like buffering you against the negative effects of stress, like it can increase your lifespan to connect with people, even for a couple of minutes each day in a very present manner. And I think that in our very fast-paced world where we always have one eye on our devices and we're always running, like deep connection is one of the first things to go. So I think that and just finding and prioritizing those micro moments of connection, and also striving for like actually deeper connections, like showing a little bit of your real self to someone, because it's impossible to ever feel really connected or supported or accepted for who you are if you're always hiding parts of yourself. And so I think that a lot of people walk around performing, which just perpetuates their feelings that like they're not acceptable as they are. And so that would be one big one.
Yeah. How do people, no, this is great. I actually last week, well, I guess it'll be several weeks when this airs, but did a live stream on loneliness in men in particular, but it's actually an epidemic. As our Surgeon General has written a huge report last year, it's an epidemic in all. And how, I totally agree with you. And there's all this great research. The Harvard longevity study shows it's the biggest correlate for what leads to a long and healthy life is the breadth and depth of your social connections. Yeah. What are some ways in which you help your clients or help yourself cultivate stronger connections, especially if you're like, I think at work, a lot of times people feel like they can't be that vulnerable self. Like they're sort of like have this certain relationship, a professional relationship. Maybe it's not in line with that. I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And so, I mean, again, the first is for so many of these, the first is the why, like recognizing the value of it. Another issue is, I mean, put down your phone when you're speaking to someone, because the science shows literally if there is a phone on the table when two people are having a conversation, even if it's face down and no one looks at it, both people rate the conversation as being less valuable and the other person is being less empathic and less trustworthy. It literally just like pulls us away. It's crazy. So put the phone away. Even if it's just for a minute, look someone in the eye, give them your full presence. And the thing is, like, it doesn't have to take a lot of time if we just are fully present, but there's little too. And so it's a silly icebreaker, but I actually love this. And so when I talk with teams or like leaders or mentorship programs, the rosebud thorn icebreaker for starting a meeting, for literally everyone says one good thing, a rose, one challenge they're dealing with, and then a thorn, and then one thing they're excited about, which is a bud. And literally, like, even that, you will just get a little snippets of people's lives. Like, oh, they really like this, or oh, they're excited about this, or oh, they have a family. Like, who knew? And so, like, whenever I start a program, what I love to do is do positive introductions. So take 2 minutes and tell your partner, the person next to you, a story of a time when you were your very best self, like a time when you were just imbued with a sense of joy, meaning, or purpose. And then I have them come back and they're so engaged. And I'm like, how many of you just learned something about your colleague or your classmate that you would not have learned about them, in the past 5 years of working together? And they all raise their hand. And I say, how much more energized do you all feel after that conversation than you normally do? And so they all raise their hands. And so being vulnerable, it doesn't even have to be sharing things that you're worried about or you're stressed about. Like, of course, that's another way. But just even sharing like human aspects of yourself. And it's just also, it just makes everything so much more interesting too. And what happens is, like, once one person shares a human aspect of their self, then humanity and vulnerability begets more humanity and vulnerability. And so from a leadership standpoint, like, how can you model this stuff? And then, because it only takes one or two people to start changing the culture. This is actually something, it's like when people witness other people perform acts of kindness, and then there's a ripple effect. They're much more likely to perform acts of kindness. And so, like, how can we start shifting these dynamics either from the top down or the ground up?
Wow, that's really cool. I think thinking about it in terms of this ripple effect and how it can reverberate, and also just that even at work where we have our guard up, even at work, like especially at work, we can have conversations where we're fully present, where we put the phone away, where we look someone in the eye, where we ask them something or learn something that's meaningful to them. And then, it's not that the work changes, but you're going to work with your friends.
Completely. And I think gratitude, that's another thing that I would say in terms of just basic practices. So how can we counter our negativity biases, which, I mean, I would say that, all humans are born with negativity biases. We focus more on the negative than the positive. I would say lawyers and doctors, we have heightened negativity biases because we're literally trained to look for the issues. But how can we counter that? So we can counter that by doing the 3 good things exercise. So identifying 3 good things that happened at the end of each day. And again, we're training our brain to look for the good. And in fact, the US military has incorporated that exercise into their master resilience training program, but they call it the hunt the good stuff exercise. So how can we hunt the good stuff? But also just communicating gratitude. So again, this is the interpersonal ripple effect. So someone did something nice, like send them a note being like, I really appreciated you doing this thing for me. Like I saw that and that made a difference for me. And oh my goodness, there's actually a study. I love this. People overestimate how awkward it will be to send someone a thank you note, and they underestimate how good it will make the other person feel and how good it will make them feel. So like, how can we, just start basically fabricating these positive interactions? And so there's they've done research on this. There's a positivity ratio of 3 to 1. So we need 3 positives to counterbalance every negative. So we can try to minimize the negatives. But another way is like, if we can just like a pebble and feathers, right? So one thing is like, how can we get rid of the pebbles? But if we can just start collecting some more feathers to bring the positive up, that's another way of like increasing our well-being while focusing on what we can control. And the great thing about the training your brain to look for the positives is that there's so many things happening around us. Our brains are pulled to the negative, either noticing them or ruminating on them, on focusing on them. But if we can train ourselves to see these other positive things too, we will look for them, and to notice them, we'll experience so much more positive. And they were there all along. So we're not even changing anything. We're not creating anything. We're not adding anything. We're just changing where we're placing our focus. And then going back to the broaden and build theory. So if I notice something that makes me happy, that will increase my awareness. It'll increase my creativity. Maybe it'll cause me to show up more open in a room, and I'll smile at someone. And then that'll make them happy. And then again, these ripple effects. And so like, we're all very familiar with the downward spirals. Turns out we can also spiral upwards. We just need to be kind of like open and intentional about it.
You're filling me with so much like optimism and I love it. It is contagious.
Yes.
No, it's great. I would actually go further to say you said it doesn't change like what's around you, but I think over time it does. Because I think once you start to focus on these things, you look for opportunities to create more of that in your life.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And that's the second part of the broaden and build. So the broaden, the positive emotions, they open us up, they broaden our awareness. But then those daily experiences of broadened thinking and awareness create opportunities for us to build more social, emotional, physical resources that then trigger more positive emotions and create that upward spiral. And really because it's contagious, I guess when my point was, there will always be certain things that maybe we can't control, but there's a lot that we can change even within the context of that. And I think, bottom up, top down, it all should be happening. But I guess the good news is that you can start literally anywhere and make some sort of change that goes beyond just your situation. The last thing is that because of what we're talking about, I think that for a lot of people, I'm sure you've heard this, right? Self-care is selfish. Like, oh, I shouldn't be focusing on my happiness. I should be trying to help others. And it's like, start with you. You want to help others, start with you, because modeling it to others, but also you making these changes on yourself will radiate outwards.
Yes. And if you're burnt out, if you're exhausted, I say that to myself now, like I make it a point, just like you're saying, to get movement in and to take time to breathe and meditate. And I know, like, and my family knows, like, what a big difference it makes. They're like, just go outside, go for a run. Like, don't come back.
Completely. And absolutely. And the same is true for me now that I'm in my coaching role. Like, I can only show up for my clients fully with my full energy and my full presence, which I recognize is like my greatest value as a coach if I'm taking care of myself. But the same thing is true for the doctors and for the lawyers. Like you don't want your doctor doing surgery on you if they're burnt out, and you don't want your lawyer like litigating your case if you're burnt out. So why is this overwork a status symbol?
It makes no sense until you disentangle the sort of societal factors, which I think you've done a really good job. Okay, Jordana, so you are at the health feast. It's funny, this is the question we ask, but then as I was like conceptualizing it more recently, I'm like, we always ask this question, like, you're coming to the health feast. And then I was like, wait, they're already there. Okay. And you're bringing your mindset tip or life philosophy to share instead of a dish. Like, what is Jordana brought to the health feast?
Yeah, so I think just going back to what we were saying, I would bring this self-compassion as a mindset and recognizing that if you are someone who has been fueling yourself with self-criticism and self-doubt, and you're feeling like, oh, well, yeah, it's painful, but I need it. I must hold on to it because it's the reason I'm so successful. What I want to say is that is not true. You've gotten here despite all of that and not because of it. And if you can let go of that and just feast on some self-compassion, I promise, as indulgent as that sounds to feast on self-compassion, it will not make you indulgent or complacent or lazy or gluttonous. It will actually just turbocharge all of the best in you and enable you to do so much more.
Yes, I love that you said feast on it. Thank you. If people want to, we'll put links to your website, but if people want to learn more about the work you do, if they want to work with you, like, what are some ways that you work with folks?
Sure. So I'm a coach, so I do one-on-one coaching with individuals. I do trainings and workshops for organizations. If anyone wants to build a more positive workplace culture that will not detract from performance, either way, or if you're just interested in reading more of the chronicles from a recovering type A plus perfectionist, you can find me at my website, JordanaConfino.com, and then LinkedIn is probably the platform where I'm most active, and it's Jordana Confino. And as you can probably tell, I love talking about these topics. And so if anyone has any questions or just wants to explore it more, please don't hesitate to reach out. I would love to support you.
Oh my God, you have so much passion and energy for this. It's like so palpable. Like, I feel it. I experienced it. It's so cool. And you just want to help so many other people live their best life. Like, that's compassionate to others. That's so compassionate to others. And so I just want to really call that out. You also have this values exercise on your website, which I like downloaded or submitted.
Yes. And so so on my website, I've got a self-compassion guide and a values guide. And I'll give you the link between the values and everything I've been talking about. What I realized about perfectionism is that perfectionists are never playing to win. They're just playing not to lose. So you're never actually feeling that satisfaction or that pride. You think you're avoiding feeling a little bit more shame and fear than you're already carrying around with you on a daily basis, best case scenario. And so how can we start playing to win? And I really think that playing to win is living a life that's driven by your values and not by your fear. And in order to do that, on the one hand, we need to rein in the self-criticism, but then the other one is to figure out what our values are so that we can more intentionally honor them. And so if anyone is like me and maybe haven't thought about what your values are recently, or you feel like maybe you've been pulled away from them, the Values Discovery Guide is a great tool to help you either identify or just reconnect with those values. And again, identify practical steps for increasing your alignment wherever you are in your current life or career.
Oh, no, I think it's really cool. And now I understand you were sharing how you went through a similar exercise. And that was a big life-changing moment for you. Yeah. And you have so many examples of values. I think when I was thinking of my own and then I looked at the list, I was like, oh my God, yeah, there are so many things. Anyway, this has been such a incredible experience for me to talk to you and to learn so much and to feel your passion and energy. And I feel so uplifted. And that is the ripple effect. I hear you.
I love it so much. And this was such a pleasure for me as well. So thank you so much for having me on and letting me spend this time with you.
Okay, Jordana, we do our requisite Fist bump. There you go to the camera. Nice. Boom. Okay. Thank you all, Health Feast listeners. You can visit us at thehealthfeast.com. If you have a question for us, sign up for my newsletter, Rock On, which comes out every Monday, some reflection, awareness, and kindness. And we'll see you back here next time.